can I call you Noam?
Sure.
Okay.
Everyone else does.
Because just a bit of background of me. So I've been teaching in Dundee University, which is in Scotland. I'm originally from Bangladesh, born in during the war of Pakistan-Bangladesh war in 1971. So I'm a kind of war child. So like quite a traumatic childhood, which created problem for my mental health. So I suffer from obsessive compulsive disorder over the years. So every day is like lots of things I have to do, rituals. So when I was preparing for the talk today, I was extremely nervous. I was over reading too many things. And I thought that when I see you, I will just, I cannot speak anymore. But my memory with you is I was doing my PhD in the early 2000s. My PhD is on East Timor. You are one of the persons I was reading during that time, and Amy Goodman. I still remember 1991 when Santa Cruz massacre, which is called Dili massacre, where 250 persons were killed. And you are the only voice in the West was talking about this, and no one knew much about East Timor. East Timor got lucky in 1997 when Indonesia got bankrupt, and the USA more or less played a positive role there after that. But for Palestinians, they were not lucky. So my plan is to talk about mainly Oslo Accord. But before that, how much time you have today for me?
Well, let's aim for half an hour or so, and if it goes longer, okay.
Okay. So my idea is just we do a conversation, no question answers, nothing, whatever comes up. Like two of the important things, I really want to focus on Oslo Accords. And two of the things came out just after Oslo is like your piece in Z magazine and Edward Said's morning after. Two of the criticisms came out from the West, but the rest of the media, the rest of the intellectual world were praising the whole thing. One of the things you mentioned in your article that Times was praising this, like this is the fall of Berlin Wall for the Middle East. But you were furious. Edward Said was furious. Edward Said said that this is a capitulation for the Palestinians, everything. This is a Versailles for the Palestinians. So going back, how do you see those days, like your memories?
You're quite right about the media celebration, the intellectual community celebration. But it's very interesting to read the way the celebration was presented. So in the New York Times, for example, their most independent critical voice is Anthony Lewis, who celebrated the fact that the Palestinians had finally given up their commitment to violence and were willing to accept accommodation and peace. It's exactly the opposite of what had happened for 30 years. Can't mention it in the New York Times, but in fact, in 1976, the PLO supported a UN Security Council resolution which called for a two-state settlement on the international border with guarantees of the right of each state to exist in peace and security, supported by most of the world. Israel was furious. Yitzhak Rabin, prime minister, said Israel will refuse even to attend the Senate, the meetings, and Israel will never negotiate with the Palestinians over anything. The United States vetoed the resolution. Well, that goes on like that. 1988, the Palestinian National Council formally proposed a two-state settlement. Israel reacted. It was a coalition government. Yitzhak Shamir, Shimon Peres, they reacted with a formal statement saying there can be no additional Palestinian state between Israel and Jordan, meaning they declared Jordan to be a Palestinian state by Israeli Fayad, doesn't matter what the people think, and there can't be another Palestinian state. Added that anything in the what they called Judea and Samaria, the West Bank and Gaza, will be settled according to the directives of the Israeli government, period. The United States endorsed that in the Baker Plan. That's the immediate, and it goes on like that. But for Anthony Lewis, the Palestinians had always been devoted to violence, and the Israelis love peace, and so on. Meanwhile, all kind of atrocities were going on, violence, Israeli terror, but it didn't matter. And that's the left wing. On the right, it's worse. Edward and I both immediately recognized what was happening. It wasn't at all obscure. There had been negotiations under U.S. leadership, the Madrid negotiations. They were led, the Palestinian side was led by Haider al-Shafi, probably the most respected person in the occupied territories, in the Palestinian community, honest, incorruptible, serious nationalist. The negotiators were getting nowhere because al-Shafi insisted that they at least include termination of the expansion of the illegal Israeli settlement projects. Well, Arafat was losing support radically in the territories. There were, remember, I mean, you know this, of course, but there were a split between the inside Palestinians and the external ones, the Tunis-based PLO, basically bureaucrats. And the inside population was losing its commitment to the external Palestinians. Actually, I saw this myself. It was during the Intifada, 1988. I did travel pretty extensively through the occupied territories with a Palestinian friend, Azmi Bishara. And when we talked to Palestinians, they basically didn't want to have anything to do with the PLO. If you asked them, what's your attitude toward the PLO? They would say, well, they're political representatives, but we want to run our own affairs. We don't want them. This was happening all throughout the territories. Arafat understood it. He was losing control. So he did a kind of an end run through Norway to make an agreement that would put him back in control. It was a serious defeat for the Palestinians. He gave up everything, everything. You read the Declaration of Principles, that famous day of awe on the White House lawn. It offers the Palestinians nothing. The text is right there. It says the final outcome at the end of the whole process will be based on security resolutions 242 and 338. Anyone literate knows what that means. There's nothing there for the Palestinians, nothing. It says the refugee rights have to be respected somehow. Well, that's the end result of the negotiations. Total giveaway, nothing, perfectly clear and explicit, right there on paper. The West, of course, welcomed the United States particular as finally the Palestinians agreed for peace and so on. But it was just a grotesque joke. And Yitzhak Rabin, who was prime minister, made it very explicit that this is not going to affect the settlement project. In fact, he took pride in the fact that under his regime as prime minister, settlements increased even faster than under the ultra-right Shamir government, which preceded him. In fact, that happened year after Oslo, enormous increase in settlement. I mean, Rabin was assassinated, so a tragic event, and then mythology was constructed about the great peacekeeper, but absolutely nothing. If anything, his successor, Shimon Peres, was worse. Now, he's also hailed as a great peacekeeper. He was one of the main architects of settlement deep inside the West Bank at a time when others were more restrained. His last press conference, 1996, he told the press that there will never be a Palestinian state, period. That's the great peacekeeper. Well, so it continued. The illusions on this that were spread were utterly astonishing. Israel and the United States moved at once to undermine the Oslo Accords, bad as they were. So one element of the Oslo Accords was that there can be no distinction between the West Bank and Gaza. They are one territorial entity, inseparable. US and Israel moved at once to separate them, totally separate. Somebody's seriously ill in Gaza, wants to get to a Palestinian hospital in Ramallah, in Jerusalem, where there's a good, have to go through endless bureaucratic maneuvers. They may never be allowed to go. I mean, even that, instantly right after Oslo, Israel and the United States had absolutely no illusions about this. They were spread, illusions were spread by the media, by propaganda and so on, but it was transparent that there was nothing to them. Finally, in retrospect, years later, is the beginning of recognition that it was all a farce.
Edward Said was writing in his memory that in the late 70s, Cyrus Vance, Secretary of State, actually requested Edward Said to speak to Arafat and convince him to accept 242 and 338 resolutions, with the addition that, USA will recognize the Palestinian rights and the Palestinians' right for self-determination. And when Edward Said asked Arafat about this, Arafat more or less categorically said no. So from that position, in 1991, obviously what you are saying, the Intifada played a big role, and Intifada more or less took away some of the powers from PLO, which was based in Tunisia during that time. So after Lebanon expulsion in 1982, so 6-7 years gap, more or less Tunisia was far away from the epicenter. And also, I think the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, I think Arafat did some strategic mistake. He took side with Saddam Hussein. That also weakened his position. But at the same time, Israel was also struggling with the Intifada, because this is the non-violent grassroots level resistance where children are throwing stones to the tank. And this is a total PR disaster for IDF. IDF is good with fighting with F-16 and tanks, but they're not good in fighting against the children who are throwing stones. So for Israel, it was very strategic what they're doing. They knew what they're doing. For Palestinians, they got this bogeyman, Arafat, more or less. Even at one point, he excluded everyone, all the experts, and decided to do the negotiation himself and a couple of very close members of his team. Edward Said was saying that this is the people who actually don't understand even English. So they are reading this huge amount of paper trail, got no understanding what's going on. So the outcome will be more or less predictable what's going to happen. And I think you mentioned in your article that it's like negotiation between an elephant and a fly, and you know the outcome, who will win here.
Well, all I would add is that Arafat understood this very well. For him, it was a power play. How can I get back into power? He didn't care what the effect was on the Palestinians. And in fact, Haider al-Shafi even refused to come to the great event where they shook hands. Mahmoud Darwish, Shafiq al-Khut just resigned from the Palestinian National Commission. I mean, the serious people among the Palestinian leadership just wanted out. Even Faisal Husseini, who was Arafat's representative, said, we didn't get anything, you know. I mean, I don't know what Edward says about them not knowing what was going on is correct, but I don't really think it mattered much because they did not want to understand. They just wanted an agreement which would get Arafat back into power in what was called the Gaza-Jericho framework. Arafat could put up a palace in Gaza and say he has an office in Jericho. Meanwhile, Israel could go ahead and do whatever it liked under Rabin in Paris, who, you know, by Israeli standards may be called doves, but that's not much of a barrier. They were super hawks. And, I think Arafat understood it completely. So yes, they didn't get anything, but they didn't care much. The Norwegian role is kind of interesting. You probably know this, but Norway, the Norwegian government commissioned a Middle East scholar, Hilde Vaga, to do a study of the Norwegian role in the negotiations. She found, to her amazement, that the Norwegian government had destroyed all of the documents. They were all missing. They didn't want anybody to know what they were up to. And she wrote about it anyway and concluded that Norway was just an errand boy for Israel.
One of the historical figure, the Roman historian, Tacitus, his famous quote is, he was talking about empire, Roman Empire, and when the generals were preparing for the war against Scotland. And the famous quote is, they create a desert, but they call it peace. So they vandalize the whole thing. They create this desolated place, but they name it peace. Am I right to say that? I mean, is it like that kind of connotation? I mean, what we saw subsequently is just the destruction of the whole thing. The more settlements, more violence, and everything is gone. And this is 29th years.
That's a pretty fair description. And it continues right up to the moment. Just the last few days, Israel by now is completely brazen. They're not even trying to cover up what they're doing. They're so confident with US support that they'll do anything. Today, for example, Israel announced that there's a possibility that the Palestinian journalist who was killed, Shireen al-Malami, it's possible that she was killed by an Israeli soldier by accident, but they're not going to have any inquiry, and they're not permitting an international inquiry. What's the US reaction? US reaction is to say, we have faith in the independence of the Israeli judicial system, so this finishes the issue. Okay, they do whatever they like. They've just passed regulations, which you've seen, I'm sure, that say that if a visiting Palestinian has a romantic affair with a Palestinian in the occupied territories, have to report it to the Israeli authorities, who will then keep them under surveillance. I mean, there is no humiliation that is too much for the Israeli Israeli government to impose. Actually, I should say that all of this was quite predictable. Israel is one of the few countries I know of where the younger generation is more reactionary than the older one. The older one still has some vague memory when there were elements of social democracy. Now it's just pure racism, extreme racism. They don't care. And brazen. They're confident that the US will back them no matter what they do. So they figure they can do anything and just thumb their nose at everyone else. Actually, I should say they are aware, the more sophisticated of them, carrying out a very dangerous experiment. It might turn out that in the 1970s, they made a decision. This is the Labor Party, the Doves, to choose expansion over security. There was clear opportunity for peace along the lines of the 1976 Security Council resolution and others like it. They decided no, they want to expand. They don't care about peace or security. That meant that they are totally dependent on the United States. It's US backing versus the world. They become more and more isolated, more and more despised. The reactionary Arab dictatorships will go along with them for their own reasons, but not the world population. And they understood that they're losing support from the more liberal, more humanist elements in the world society, and counting on the United States to support them no matter what. Well, that's fragile. American opinion is changing very strikingly. Israel used to be the darling of the liberal left, people like Anthony Lewis. That's disappearing. Now its support is among the most reactionary segments of American society, along with the huge evangelical community, who are incidentally the most extreme anti-Semites in human history. Just take a look at their doctrine. Their doctrine is that there'll be conflict in Israel, lead to Armageddon, everybody kills each other. The saved souls go to heaven. The rest go to eternal damnation. That's the Jews. Can't get more anti-Semitic than that. But that's their support, increasingly the support for those reasons. Well, plus the military system in the United States, very closely integrated with the Israeli military, more hyper-nationalist elements, most deeply elements in the, in fact, one interesting example of that is the Abraham Accords. They were hailed as a great tribute to peace. What were they? The most brutal reactionary regimes in the Middle East, Northeast African region were brought together in support of the brutal, vicious, annexationist Israel. Wonderful achievement, hailed all over the West. Well, I think that this is fragile. I have a feeling it's going to collapse. It's not going to be tolerated forever. The more brazen, the more extreme they become, the more their support declines among more liberal, humane elements. And I think sooner or later it'll tip, and then they're in deep trouble. They have no support.
Two things. I mean, like if you talk about 70s, it looks like America has got some kind of understanding about Palestinian cause, Palestinian rights, or Palestinian self-determination, like the things I mentioned about. So from there, to today's this Abraham Accord. I mean, it's just like, I mean, it's just what we are doing, what America is doing, what West is doing. It's just going backward. It's like more like primitive model where they will create this desert, but they will also still call it a peace. One of the story was before Oslo, the Palestinians actually used to travel from Ramallah, from Gaza, and all those cities to like all over Israel without any kind of barriers. But once Oslo is done, they started seeing all the walls being created, all kind of security barriers, all kind of checkpoints. So I mean, so Oslo is like, I mean, why they call it peace accords?
Peace means we, the power systems, like the outcome. That's peace. If systems of power and domination like the outcome, they call it peace. Total hypocrisy. I mean, it's like it's life. Take the Ukraine war. It's very interesting to see U.S. elite reaction. If you have a chance, take a look at the current issue of Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal. It's a very revealing essay in it. It's by two well-informed foreign policy analysts who are pretty much at the liberal extreme of opinion. They're not right-wing maniacs. This is Fiona Hill and Angela Stent. It's a very interesting article. They condemn the global South because they don't recognize what the US does, that Russia violated the UN Charter and violated international law. How come they don't understand that? People in the South just collapse in ridicule. I mean, this is what you've been doing to us for centuries. You don't give a damn about international law. These two authors go on to say that the global South, I'm talking about India mainly, is so evil that they compare the Russian invasion of Ukraine to the US actions in Iraq and Vietnam. How can anybody sink so low? I mean, the whole world literally collapses in ridicule, but that's elite, the little cocoon in which elite opinion resides in the United States, including its liberal elements. I mean, it's a free society, but the most deeply indoctrinated probably in history. Just cannot see what's obvious to everyone in the world. You have to really read it to see it. But that's what you're describing in Oslo is about the same, and there are plenty of other examples. I mean, to this day, you cannot find anyone, virtually, try to find anyone in the US who's anywhere near the mainstream who will even say that the Iraqi invasion was a crime. You're allowed to say it was an error. So Obama is greatly praised because he called it a strategic blunder, imitating Nazi generals who described the invasion of Russia as a strategic blunder. Should have knocked out England first. Do we praise them as great heroes? I mean, that's Obama way at the left. And nobody can understand this. And it's almost impossible to get it across. I mean, it can go on, but it's such an old story. I mean, the United States is very insular. It's separated from global opinion in innumerable ways. This is one of them.
Like, I mean, In a couple of your recent interviews, you talked about one of those like Gallup polls around the world, which basically asked that which country is the most dangerous country in the world. And number one post gone to America.
That poll was interesting. It's a Gallup poll, a US run poll, was never reported in the United States.
And the second one is like, I think Amy Goodman was asking you a question about, according to you, which organization is the most dangerous organization? And everyone is looking for answer like, Al-Qaeda or like ISIS, but you said that Republican Party.
It's quite true. It's by now beginning to be recognized. So there was an interesting article recently in the London Financial Times. It's not exactly a radical rag, the leading business journal in the world. One of their top correspondents, Edward Luce, said that he'd been following murderous, violent groups all over the world for 30 years, but he's never seen anything as contemptible, dangerous, nihilistic as the current Republican Party. And interestingly, there was a reaction by a former head of the CIA who said, yes, he agrees.
The most interesting part is like, obviously Trump played a big role in this current Republican Party. I mean, during his term, he hired his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to make peace with the Palestinians by excluding Palestinians to make peace for Palestinians. And he called it the deal of the century. It's like, I mean, you can see that. I mean, it gone so bad now in American politics about in terms of foreign policy. It's just reckless. Everything is reckless. They're sending weapons to Taiwan. They're doing things with like Ukraine situation instead of negotiations or trying to find some kind of solution.
Take negotiations and diplomacy. It's very interesting. You could take Ukraine. In the United States, if you propose negotiations and diplomacy, you're bitterly condemned as a Putin lover, communist sympathizer, and so on. Even respected people like Henry Kissinger. Cross the ocean, go to Germany. 77% of the population in Germany want negotiations right now. I doubt that that'll be reported in the United States, but that's Germany. It's not the global South, where of course everybody's calling for negotiations to end this war. United States, you're demonized if you even propose it. Even on the left, you're demonized. It's pretty shocking. So
Noam, like, the way we are seeing the world right now in terms of climate politics, fossil fuel industry, the war in Europe, and all kind of things are like churning up everywhere. And we saw like the rise of far right parties in like middle of Europe. I mean, sometimes because I'm a war child, I get anxious every day that it can flip very soon. And that's the end.
yeah, I think that's quite true. I think Europe is in the midst of some serious rethinking about whether they should continue to hang on to Washington's coattails and suffer the effects. And of course, Europe is suffering severely from the US refusal to allow any kind of negotiations in Ukraine. The United States is immune. Doesn't affect the United States. In fact, it's a benefit. Fossil fuel companies love it. Military industries love it. No shortages in the United States, no problem. Not so for Europe. There's a natural relation between Western Europe and Russia. Russia has resources, scientific talent. Western Europe doesn't have the resources. It has industry, technology. It's just an accommodation has to be reached. And I think European populations are coming to see that. That's why you have 77% of the population of Germany calling for negotiations to end the war. In the United States, you can't even make the statement. I'm afraid I'm going to have to get off to the next interview.
Thank you. No, that's fine. Absolutely fine. I might come back to you in future about lots of things, but it's just like one of those things. I'd love to talk to you more. And you take care of yourself, Noam.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.